this video, we're going to take a look at what was required to modify the Suzuki DT225 outboard motor powerhead for use in the TV27R project. There are places to pick up a structural mount from the engine, and with the upper cowling removed, we get our first glance of the 2.7 litre two-stroke V6 it's hiding inside. Note it's got 2 spark plugs per cylinder. You can already see in these photos things like the removable water jackets over the exhaust ports. This is an important part of this project. It helps remove some of the heat from what will be the cooling system eventually. First though, we need to dismantle it and get the power head onto the bench. Here we can see the fuel cooling injectors and also some of the superfluous marine specific parts that won't be used on the project and be removed. They're to do with cutting the engine off if it tips over. Of course, it's a safety feature. It won't be needed on the project. The fixings for the water-cooled exhaust port jackets on both sides came out equally poorly, with the dissimilar metals in the age and the water involved. Note also here the ignition pickups on the rear of the starter ring gear. With the water jackets off and over the exhaust port, we also get a good chance to have a look at what we can see of the pistons. It all looks to be in pretty good shape in there. There's a fair bit of corrosion around in the water jacket itself. We can need a good clean out as well as removing the broken fixings. Removal of the intake manifold allows us to look directly downwards into the crankcase, and we can see the crankshaft and the big ends of the connecting rods. We can see the circular divider on the crankshaft that separates the 2 cylinder banks where the con rods share a common crank pin centre to keep them separate. Everything actually looks pretty good in there. Here's the other side of the intake manifold itself, showing the 72 reed valves that help this big engine to breathe. We'll also be retaining the original throttle body, which you can see on the back of the intake manifold here. We can dismantle it a little further to get it outside for a closer look. The starter ring gear was a bit of a conundrum. I had thought about removing it as I did in Black Max, but it's actually a very neat self-contained unit. Inside is the rotor for the alternator, as well as all the ignition parts and the pickups for the fuel injection, and I want to retain that system overall. So on this one I'm thinking about leaving it as it is. Originally I thought I'd have to construct a tubular steel space frame chassis to take the engine, because it's a little bit bigger than Black Max, the Mercury V6, and by the time you added in a gearbox onto the end of it, I thought that's what we would have to do. But it's running a tape rule over it showed that it's not that much bigger than what could be adapted to fit into the Hayabusa chassis, so I thought we'd give it a go. The only thing I'll remove is the emergency pull cord start ring. That's not going to be necessary on this. So I then went ahead and ordered a Hayabusa frame, complete with the P5 certificate and even a current MOT. It certainly arrived very well packed. A first offering up of the frame over the engine showed that it was in fact very close to fitting in most ways, but with a little bit of tweaking in here and there, and mostly to the engine, could be made to fit even better. So we've now reached the point of no return. As soon as I start to cut pieces off of the engine to make it fit better into the frame, it was never going to go back into an outboard motor again. But that was always the intention, so it had to be done. Here I'm starting to remove parts of the cylinder block castings which form the mating face to mount the lower leg onto. These obviously aren't going to be needed, and cutting them off allows the motor to sit much nicer in the frame and save a little bit of weight. The castings are quite thick in places, so it takes a wee bit. With that cut off, it opens up the end of the exhaust port on the rear cylinder bank, but that can be closed off again later. With the excess castings cut off, you can see that they really are only forming a mating flange before. They're not in any way structural to the engine as such, but they do incorporate the exhaust ports, so these will have to be blanked off anyway. So with that done, we can have another check fit of the frame over the engine. It's already sits so much nicer and a bit lower, closer to where I want to get it. The rear cylinder bank in particular is able to sit so much higher up into the frame. It's certainly compact and quite tight, but it's possible. The next step then is trying to form mountings for the engine into the frame. We want to use all of the original Hayabusa engine mounting points, but another difficulty is there aren't a huge number of places on the engine to take structural fixings from. Here we're starting on the offside front mountings, making up steel adapter plates basically. I'm not messing about. I want this to be strong. There's an awful lot in torque involved with this engine. I want it to be. Here we're doing the same thing on the rear side if it's possible. Picking up firstly on the cylinder fixing studs, since it's only strong sections round there. Not ideal, but it gives us a good strong fixing into the engine. Once I've established the basic brackets and fixing points to the engine, we can start to work out where they need to be to pick up on the frame mountings that would normally carry the Hayabusa engine. I want to keep it all original as I can as possible here. After checking that it's all in the correct position and in alignment, we can then go ahead and put a few little tack welds onto these new brackets, and then continue to add further strengthening to them to really make it as strong as possible. Once I'm happy that I've got everything in the right basic position, I can remove it again, remove all brackets together, and bub mouth the joints with a grinding disc or a die grinder to get good penetration. Do it from one side first, then the other, to make sure it's really solid joints. You'll see there that I've also managed to get a couple of really good fixings directly down into the upper top of the crankcase itself. I'll leave a tunnel under this bracket to get the wiring up from the alternator and ignition side too. I removed the rear cylinder head at this stage to make it a little easier to trim back the block side, but I also wanted to have an inspection of the bores. They all look in great shape. You can still see the hone marks, and also clear out some of the aluminium that found its way in there. Note the slightly unusual twin spark plug arrangement on the cylinder heads here. The bore doors look very good, but all that aluminium that's accumulated in there needs to be cleaned out. I started to make this aluminium alloy blanking plate, but I'm going to make a much heavier cast alloy blanking plate instead. It's too thin. For the upper near side engine mounting bracket, there really aren't very many options for fixings at all. It's all that's there really is the cylinder head bolts themselves, and on that side the new partially redundant thermostat housing is in the way, so brackets are made up to allow mounting onto them and allow the water still to circulate. With the new mounting bracket roughly formed, it could be offered up to the cylinder head and tried against the old redundant thermostat housing. It picks up on 2 cylinder head studs and 4 of the original thermostat housing bolts. The engine no longer uses these tiny thermostats anyway. They were a way of preventing the engine overcooling using seawater or lake water. They're very, very small and very restrictive. We need a higher flow rate. So that's about it for the near side upper mounting. Moving on now to the off side upper mounting. It's equally tricky. Again, there's not much in the way of fixings. We can only really pick up on one of the cylinder head covered bolts, and fortunately there's a fairly substantial piece of the block with a hole in it that we left earlier, didn't cut off, and that'll make a half decent fixing point. The bracket actually bolts to the underside of the protrusion in the block casting, and the clearance is set with shim washers. So now, with the first the four major engine mounting brackets in place to pick up on the existing Hayabusa fixings, the engine's fairly well fixed in place now. It should be fairly obvious that the original intake manifold is going to be far too tall to fit underneath the engine. So the first step is cutting it back. So we remove it. Here it is with all 72 of its reed valves. And we cut it back quite severely, right back as far as we can to the end of the fuel rail fixings. You might also notice that the intake runners are slightly asymmetrical if you look at the gaps. Anyway, we can get the manifold clamped up in the vise and marked up to start cutting. With the side walls of the inlet runners now cut away on the face on the opposite side of the fuel rail and injectors, it can be tidied up, prepared, edges radiused, ready to meet up to the new welded on tube, which will feed from the intake plenum, which will now sit underneath the gearbox. But for the time being, it's sitting on the front of the engine in the original position. As you can see in this very early photo, the fuel rail and injectors are still on the rear of the intake manifold, just below the gearbox. Originally the thought was to take the throttle body from the front, but after a rethink on this, it'd be much better if it was the other way around. So we'll be rotating the intake manifold. It's asymmetrical, so it needs it's a tiny bit of adapting. But the idea is, as I say, flip it around the other way. Just to give a sense of proportion, here's an old 750 SRAD fuel tank sat on, and a partially made subframe. Even though this was still a very early stage in the project, I decided I wanted to use a Suzuki SV1000S upper fairing to really move things away from the Hayabusa number of parts being used, and also to give an overall feel for the bike so that you can work the rest of the components around that. It didn't take a lot of a simple bracket and alteration to fit the Hayabusa chassis, and then I'm starting to scribe in the fairing to fit the much wider Hayabusa frame. But overall I think it worked quite well, a little bit at a time. Just keep scribing it in, cutting it back until you get a nice fit. And then of course use aluminium riv nuts, mark the frame, use aluminium riv nuts to hold the rear sections of the upper fairing in the position I wanted them in. With that part of the job more or less done, it lets you work out a surprising number of other things. And so here we are with the upper fairing mounted onto the bike, and also on top of the wrong subframe a seat, just to try and get an idea of what seat height would need to be to allow the exhaust from the rear cylinder bank to pass under it. In the front on photos, I think having the upper fairing in place helps to give a better impression overall of the width of the engine. While it's not the narrowest, it's not as wide as a lot of people may expect. Here, sitting alongside my own SV1000S with exactly the same fairing, you can see that it's mounted a good bit lower than it is on that. This at the time was along the lines of a road legal drag bike, low and long. We'll come back to the cosmetic and bodywork parts in a later part though. We'll need to crack on with the drivetrain. Here we're starting to make up basic cover parts for the near side of the engine. I decided I wanted to retain the starter ring gear, which incorporates the alternator and all the ignition parts as I mentioned earlier. So I also want to protect them because these are quite difficult to obtain parts now. So the idea was to make it in steel, make the whole thing in steel shaped, so that if it comes down on that side it's going to give a lot more protection than it would be if it was in aluminium alloy. So we started to fabricate these parts up. First closing up the sides and the rear, and then finally moving on to making the front sections. The only thing that was done to the starter ring gear was removal of the emergency pull cord starter, which I don't think was going to be needed. Here we just make some mild steels, like most of the rest, making 3mm cover. But now I'm moving on to the starter mounting, making parts for around the starter motor itself to be able to close that over and protect it. Again, just simple cardboard templates. You then copy them over to steel and bolt on. First we need to continue with the new side cover plate though. It's actually formed in a curve, a slight curvature on the face, it's not flat. And then 3mm steel, it takes a bit of forming, but it's a bit crude, but it works. Tacked in place. On the underside there was a flat section which I deliberately made in 5mm thick steel, because that's the part I thought if the engine is going to come down on the engine on that side, that's where it's going to be. That's why it's flattened on the underside. templated up to fill the gap between the two. As usual with these things, it's having to be made in several pieces and all tied together. That's the outer part made, still to make the inner section now, so it's done quite simply. A strip of 3mm folded into a curve that can be tacked round the outside of the centre part of the hub, and then a fairly simple flat section in the middle. Something like that. All tacked in place for a look, see what it's like, see I'm happy with it all. And it's ready for welding up. I'll just be welding this up with a MIG. Quite a high current setting to really burn it in 0.8mm wire. But you'll see I've deliberately left gaps and ground a bit of a bird mouth into the joints where they were a bit too close for my liking. But anyway, last template cut, but we'll catch up with it later because the baby foxes are looking hungry and round for their evening feed. So basically that's the engine in anyway. Engine mounted in the frame. We've got a sort of rolling chassis. We'll continue with the drivetrain in the next part 2. That'll do for today. It's starting to get dark now. So thanks for watching, and I hope you enjoyed the first part of the TV27R build. Part 2 coming up shortly, hopefully. Bye for now.